The wind had changed that morning. It wasn't the usual autumn breeze that swept through the valley, lifting leaves and laughter. No, this wind carried smoke long before the flames came. At the edge of Fairhill, past the fields where children once learned by lantern light, stood a cottage, humble, crooked, and filled with hope. That cottage belonged to Miss Clara Hayes, the orphaned teacher with no family, no fortune, but a heart so wide it fit every poor child in town. She had built that place board by board with hands blistered from work and warmed only by the thanks of her students. And yet, on that bitter Thursday morning, all it took was one match. One coward's flick of fire under the cloak of darkness. The townsfolk woke to screaming chickens, wild dogs, and a blaze that painted the sky with grief. Her neighbors stood at a distance, mouths open, unmoving, as if the fire was burning away their guilt too. Not one hand reached for a bucket. Not one voice shouted a warning. Some whispered that the fire was meant to cleanse the town of her kind, an unmarried woman who dared to speak her mind, teach the poor, and live without permission. Others just watched. As the roof of Clara's home caved in and her books curled into ash, the people of Fairhill chose silence. Clara stood barefoot in the mud, her nightgown soaked in smoke and heartbreak, holding the charred remains of her only photograph, her mother's face now smeared in soot. And in that silence, something inside her shifted. No one offered her a coat. No one invited her in. The same townsfolk whose children she'd taught to read, whose sick she'd nursed during the winter fevers, passed her without meeting her eyes. The sheriff rode by, tipped his hat with indifference, and kept moving. Clara didn't cry. She simply stared into the smoking rubble of her life, unmoved by pity, untouched by fear. In that moment, her silence wasn't surrender. It was a vow. They had tried to erase her. But from that moment forward, she decided. She would rise so high, the smoke from her past would only serve as the fragrance of her triumph. She walked to the cemetery, to the only place that still held her truth, and sat at the unmarked grave where she had once buried a locket for luck. She whispered her promise to the wind. "You gave me fire. Now watch what I build with it." And so, with no money, no roof, and no allies, she began again. Not with rage, but with vision. For Clara Hayes had once taught children how to dream. Now it was time to teach herself. Clara didn't return to the village that day. She wandered through the golden fields beyond Fairhill, her feet bleeding, her thoughts a storm of memories and blueprints. With every step, the betrayal of the townsfolk echoed louder in her chest, but so did the voices of her students, children who had once clung to her lessons like lifelines. They had scribbled their dreams on slates beneath the candlelight she paid for, laughed through hunger in her humble classroom, and looked at her as if she were the only sun in their sky. She wasn't going to let a fire, nor the people who lit it, erase that light. She came upon the ruins of an old, abandoned church hidden past the ridge. Ivy had clawed its way up the stone. The bell had long since fallen, but to Clara it looked like a skeleton waiting to be reborn. She stepped through the shattered archway and stood in the hollow space, surrounded by silence. It wasn't a ruin. It was a frame. It was her next classroom, her next home. Maybe even her legacy. She gathered fallen bricks with bare hands, one by one, stacking them under the cracked altar like she was rebuilding a sacred place. Because in her heart, it was. And while Fairhill slept easy, thinking she had vanished with the smoke, Clara was laying her foundation, quietly, fiercely, with every ounce of the strength they thought they'd taken from her. At night, she curled under torn tarps, the cold gnawing at her bones. She caught rainwater in rusted tins, scavenged wild herbs, and lit fires from pine cones and prayer. Her hands grew harder, her back grew straighter. She stitched her torn skirt with thread made from unraveled curtains she'd found in the church basement. No one came to look for her, but word began to trickle like fog through the town. Some said she had gone mad. Others swore they saw her walking with glowing eyes, building a temple with bare hands, speaking to ghosts. Rumors have power, but Clara let them grow. Because soon the same mouths that whispered against her would beg to speak her name. Then came the children. First 1, then 3, then 10. They came barefoot, hungry, and scared. They found her among the ruins with soot still on her arms and books stacked beside firewood. She didn't ask where they came from. She only opened her arms. And with no roof above them, no walls to protect them, she began teaching again. Beneath open skies, with birds as witnesses and wind as her hymn, Clara turned the wreckage into wonder. A palace wasn't made of marble, it was made of purpose, and hers had just begun. Dawn crept through the trees like an apology, and the abandoned church-turned classroom bathed in soft gold. The children gathered early, their faces still smeared with sleep, but their eyes wide with hope. They brought what little they had: broken slates, rusty nails, old spoons, and stories too heavy for their age. Clara welcomed them all. Her voice was steady now, her back no longer bent from grief. The pain from the fire had burned away her fear, and in its place stood something stronger: resolve. She wasn't just rebuilding for herself. She was building for every child this town forgot. With time, the old church walls began to rise, not from donations or mercy, but from willpower and the hands of children who had never held anything of value. Clara taught them lessons with every brick. That strength wasn't in money, but in unity. That justice didn't need to shout. It only needed to survive. They stacked wood, fetched water, mended holes with patched cloth, and sang songs in the wind to keep their spirits from breaking. The ruined space was becoming something new. It was still roofless, still scarred, but it had heartbeat now. Laughter echoed through cracked beams. Dreams hung from nails. Clara called it the Ash Palace. Meanwhile, the town of Fairhill grew uneasy. They had expected Clara to disappear, to crumble under the weight of shame and loss, but she hadn't. In fact, something was happening across the hill, something they could feel, but not explain. The sheriff received letters from nearby counties asking if it was true that an orphaned woman was building a school without walls, teaching children with no books, and healing broken homes with no sermons. His pride clenched like a fist, so he sent a deputy to investigate, not to help, but to intimidate. The deputy returned pale, confused. It's not just a school," he'd said. "It's alive." But Clara didn't flinch when they came. She looked the law in the eye and went back to placing stones. She was no longer a woman begging for space. She was a builder of purpose, and now her fire was catching. One afternoon, as the wind picked up and the children danced barefoot in the dirt, a wagon approached. It creaked with age and was driven by someone Clara hadn't seen in years. A woman from the city, dressed in dark velvet, eyes sharp with memory. She stepped down and looked around the half-built sanctuary. Then she pulled something from the wagon, a bundle of books, bound in leather and tied with twine. She placed them in Clara's hands and whispered something no one else could hear. Clara's eyes didn't well with tears. Instead, they glowed, because the city had heard, and the city was watching. The town of Fairhill could no longer ignore it. Children who once roamed the streets in silence were now singing strange new songs. Mothers whispered about their little ones, quoting poetry they had never taught. And late into the night, across the ridge, a glow shimmered from the ruins of that old church. Not fire this time, but lanterns dancing like stars over a place that had come alive again. They called it the Ash Palace. But it wasn't just a school anymore. It was a force. Some of the townsfolk grew nervous. The mayor sent a letter requesting that Clara register her efforts. The church elders called it unholy, and the wealthy donors of the town school scoffed, because while their school had marble floors, it had no soul. Parents began pulling their children from the stiff gray building on Main Street and sending them, barefoot, to the place with no walls but warmth. The teacher who once begged for chalk now had students arriving from neighboring counties. Carriages lined up in the field like prayer candles. Then came the children of those who had watched her cottage burn. The same families who once turned their backs on her now sent their sons and daughters in secret. Clara said nothing. She taught them like the rest, firmly, lovingly, with hands still scraped from stone. But she never looked for apologies. She wasn't there to heal her past. She was there to write the future. One rainy morning, the sheriff returned, this time on foot. The mud clung to his boots like shame. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the children gather under makeshift roofs, the girls reading aloud while the boys planted saplings around the rising structure. He didn't speak. Clara didn't stop her lesson. The wind carried her voice, soft but unwavering, through the trees. What they tried to bury was a seed. A journalist from the capital city came weeks later. He stayed hidden behind trees at first, sketching what he saw, too stunned to speak. Then he approached Clara and asked her only one question. "Why didn't you leave?" Clara's answer was quiet but absolute. Because the soil that burns is the same soil where things grow. Within days, headlines spread across the state. Orphaned teacher builds school of dreams from ashes, a lesson in grace and grit. The town's silence turned into whispers, whispers into awe, and awe into invitations. But Clara never left the Ash Palace. She slept there, taught there, cried there, laughed there, and every child who crossed her path left carrying more than just letters and numbers. They carried legacy. Years passed like pages in the wind, but the Ash Palace only grew stronger. What began as a hollowed-out ruin had transformed into a sanctuary of learning and healing. The old stone walls were now covered in vines that flowered every spring. The broken bell had been lifted and rung again, this time not for worship, but for mourning lessons. And at the center of it all stood Clara Hayes, no longer just the orphaned teacher, but a legend walking on her own 2 feet. People came from distant places, educators, leaders, even politicians, to witness what she had built. They expected speeches, documents, or policy blueprints. Instead, they found barefoot children quoting Shakespeare beneath the trees, building birdhouses to learn geometry, baking bread to understand chemistry. Everything was done with hands and heart. There were no golden gates or statues, only purpose, and that was the magic. Clara had created a palace not with riches, but with roots. The town that once cast her out now begged to be included in her annual gatherings. They brought gifts, painted murals, and sent their brightest children. But Clara never spoke of the fire again. She never pointed fingers or asked for apologies. Her vengeance had never been loud. It had been planted in soil, watered with grief, and harvested in the form of legacy. One winter she grew frail. Her hands, once calloused and firm, now trembled when holding chalk. The children noticed, but she smiled through it. She continued to teach from her chair, her voice softer, but her eyes brighter than ever. On her final morning, snow fell gently over the Ash Palace. The bell rang, and the children gathered. Clara sat wrapped in her mother's old quilt, watching them recite poetry in the frost. She closed her eyes, and without a word, slipped into stillness. But Clara didn't disappear. Her story was sewn into the walls, whispered in the trees, etched into every lesson passed from one child to another. They buried her not in the town cemetery, but beneath the Ash Palace itself, planting a flowering tree above her. That tree still stands today, tall, unshaken, blooming even in drought. Years later, a university was founded on her land. Its gates read, "From ashes she built us." And in every classroom across the country where a forgotten child is seen, where a girl is taught to rise, where injustice is rewritten, Clara's voice still echoes.